Cynthia Walker had always been the kind of woman who moved through life with a quiet grace, a smile that could melt hearts, and a presence that demanded attention without a single word. She was the star of Pinewood Heights, a quiet suburban neighborhood where secrets were rare and gossip traveled faster than the morning paper. Her life seemed perfect. A successful career, a charming fiancé named Richard, and a circle of friends who envied her effortless elegance. But beneath her poised exterior lay a secret, so deep, so carefully hidden, that even she sometimes forgot the weight of it. It wasn't until the night of her engagement party that the final twist unraveled. The guests were laughing, the music was soft, and the air was thick with the scent of champagne and roses. Cynthia stood at the center of it all, her white dress hugging her figure like a second skin. Richard raised his glass for a toast, his voice warm with love. To Cynthia, the woman who stole my heart and made my life complete. A round of applause followed, but just as Cynthia lifted her glass, the door swung open with a force that silenced the room. And there he stood. The one person she never expected to see again. His presence alone was enough to shatter the illusion she had spent years perfecting. Her breath caught in her throat as their eyes met. A hush fell over the crowd. Richard frowned. Who is this? Cynthia's fingers trembled against the stem of her glass. Because she knew. The moment she spoke his name, her secret, the one she had buried so deep, would finally be revealed. Cynthia's breath hitched as she gripped the glass tighter, the coolness of the champagne stem grounding her in the moment. The room was frozen in anticipation, eyes darting between her and the stranger at the door. Richard's confused gaze bore into her, silently demanding an answer. The man at the door stepped forward, his broad shoulders stiff, his face unreadable. The dim lighting of the hall cast shadows over his features, but Cynthia didn't need more light to recognize him. She had memorized every detail of his face years ago. The sharp jawline, the deep-set eyes that once held promises, the slight scar above his eyebrow from a fight they never spoke about. His name barely escaped her lips, a whisper more than a word. Michael. The murmurs in the room grew louder and Richard's frown deepened. Michael, he repeated, turning to her. Cynthia, who is this? Cynthia swallowed, her mind racing for an explanation. A lie? A deflection? But she knew nothing could stop what was about to happen. Michael wasn't here for pleasantries. He tilted his head, a bitter smile playing on his lips. She knows exactly who I am. Silence stretched between them, the weight of unspoken truths pressing against Cynthia's chest. Her carefully constructed life, one built on meticulous planning and buried memories, was on the brink of collapse. Richard let out a strained laugh, shaking his head. I don't understand. Cynthia? Cynthia opened her mouth, but no words came. The room was too small, the air too thick. The past was knocking, demanding to be let in. Michael took another step forward, his voice softer now, laced with something almost like regret. You didn't think I'd stay gone forever, did you? Cynthia's heart pounded in her ears. She had thought exactly that he would disappear like a ghost, that she would never have to confront what had been left behind. But ghosts don't stay buried forever. Richard turned to Michael, his patience wearing thin. You need to explain yourself. Why are you here? Michael let out a breath, shaking his head. That's a question for Cynthia, don't you think? Richard's grip on his champagne glass tightened, his knuckles turning white. He turned back to Cynthia, searching her face for an answer. Cynthia, he said, his voice low but firm. Tell me the truth. Who is this man? Cynthia's lips parted, But before she could answer, Michael spoke again. I'm her husband. The room gasped collectively. Cynthia felt the blood drain from her face. A ringing noise filled her ears, drowning out the whispers and the shocked exclamations. Richard took a step back, his expression shifting from confusion to something far worse. Betrayal. Husband? Richard echoed, his voice hoarse. You're married? Cynthia forced herself to breathe. She turned to Richard, panic flashing in her eyes. I can explain. Michael scoffed. Oh, I'd love to hear this explanation. Richard took another step away from her, shaking his head. You were going to marry me, Cynthia. And you never thought to mention that you already had a husband. Tears pricked her eyes. It's not what you think. Then tell me what it is, Richard demanded, his voice rising. Because right now it looks like you've been lying to me from the start. Cynthia clenched her fists. It's complicated. Michael let out a hollow laugh. Complicated? Cynthia, you disappeared. No word, no goodbye. One day, we were together, the next day you were gone. Richard turned to Michael. How long ago was this? Michael's jaw tightened. 5 years. Richard exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. 5 years. He turned to Cynthia, his voice breaking. All this time, and you never said a word. Cynthia's vision blurred. She wanted to explain, but how could she? How could she unravel a past she had fought so hard to leave behind in just a few words? Michael's voice was softer now, almost pleading. Why, Cynthia? Why did you leave? Tears slipped down her cheek. I had no choice. Michael shook his head. You always had a choice. Cynthia took a shaky breath. If I stayed, we both would have been destroyed. Richard frowned, his anger momentarily replaced by confusion. Destroyed? By what? She turned to Michael, searching his face for understanding. You remember the night before I left? Michael's expression darkened. Of course I do. How could I forget? Cynthia looked down, her fingers gripping the fabric of her dress. That night, something happened. Something I couldn't undo. Michael's breath caught. Cynthia, what did you do? She hesitated, but there was no more running, no more hiding. The secret she had buried for 5 years was clawing its way back to the surface, ready to shatter the fragile life she had built. She lifted her gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. I killed someone. The room erupted into gasps, but all Cynthia could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat. Michael's face paled. What? Richard stepped back, disbelief washing over him. Cynthia, what are you saying? She swallowed hard, her chest rising and falling with the weight of her confession. I didn't mean to. But that night, I had no choice. Michael's hands balled into fists. Who? Cynthia closed her eyes, memories flooding back in a rush of fear and regret. When she opened them, she looked straight at Michael. Your brother. Michael staggered back, as if she had physically struck him. His breath came in short, uneven bursts, his eyes wide with shock. No, that's not possible. Tears streamed down Cynthia's face. I didn't mean to, Michael. But he found out about us. He was going to hurt you. Michael's face twisted with pain, anger, grief. You should have told me. Richard's face was unreadable. He looked between them, trying to piece together the story he had unknowingly walked into. So this is why you ran? Cynthia nodded weakly. I had no choice. Michael's breathing was ragged, his fists clenched at his sides. And you were just going to start over? Pretend none of it ever happened? Cynthia wiped at her tears. I didn't know what else to do. Michael turned away, running a hand down his face, his body tense with emotions too heavy to name. Richard just stood there, staring at Cynthia like he was seeing a stranger. The weight of her past had finally caught up to her. And now, there was no escaping it. The final twist had been revealed. But the story was far from over. Cynthia's fingers trembled around the stem of her champagne glass. The entire room had gone silent. Eyes darted between her and the man standing in the doorway. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried an air of familiarity that made her chest tighten. Richard took a step forward, his brows knitting together. "Cynthia," he said slowly, his voice edged with confusion. "Who is this?" The man didn't take his eyes off Cynthia. A smirk played on his lips. But there was something else. Something darker. Something only she could recognize. He stepped further into the room, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "You're not going to introduce me?" His voice was smooth, yet laced with unspoken tension. Cynthia's throat was dry. She felt the weight of every gaze in the room. The lie she had built, the life she had so carefully crafted, was unraveling right before her eyes. She forced a shaky breath. "This is Daniel," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard glanced at her, then back at the stranger. "And who exactly is Daniel?" His tone was firm now. Daniel's smirk widened. "I'm an old friend." He paused, then tilted his head slightly. "Or should I say something more?" A murmur spread through the room. Cynthia clenched her jaw. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had buried this part of her life, locked it away, never to be unearthed again. Richard let out a short, humorless laugh. "An old friend? Well, that's interesting because Cynthia never mentioned you." Daniel took a slow step forward. "Oh, I'm sure she didn't. That's because Cynthia's been keeping a few secrets." Cynthia's heartbeat pounded in her ears. She turned to Richard, desperation flickering in her eyes. "Let's talk about this in private." But Daniel wasn't done. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "I don't think this can wait." He unfolded it and held it up for Richard, and everyone else, to see. A gasp rippled through the crowd. It was a marriage certificate. Cynthia's name was right there, printed in bold letters next to Daniel's. Richard's face paled. He turned to Cynthia, his voice barely a whisper. "Tell me this isn't real." Cynthia opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her lungs felt tight, her world spinning. Daniel gave a slow, satisfied nod. "I thought so." He turned to the crowd, gesturing toward Cynthia. "Meet my wife." The room erupted. Voices clashed, whispers turned to shocked exclamations. Cynthia felt like the walls were closing in. She looked at Richard, pleading silently, but his expression was unreadable. Hurt, betrayal, anger, all wrapped into one. "How long?" Richard asked, his voice trembling with rage. "How long were you going to keep this from me?" Cynthia swallowed hard. "I can explain." "Oh, I'd love to hear this," Daniel said, stepping even closer. "Because last time I checked, we were still legally married." The weight of his words crushed her. Richard's jaw clenched. "Still married?" Cynthia turned sharply to Daniel. "That's not true. I filed for divorce years ago." Daniel smirked. "You thought you did, but there's something you should know." He pulled out another document, this time sealed with an official stamp. He handed it to her, and her hands shook as she unfolded it. Her eyes widened in horror. The divorce was never finalized. The realization hit her like a train. Daniel had never signed the papers. Legally, they were still husband and wife. Cynthia's knees nearly buckled. The truth she had fought so hard to bury was clawing its way to the surface, and now, with the entire room watching, There was no running from it. Richard took a step back, as if looking at a stranger. All this time, you lied to me. Tears burned at the corners of Cynthia's eyes. I didn't lie. I thought it was over. I thought... Daniel chuckled darkly. Well, you thought wrong. The guests were whispering, eyes full of judgment. The engagement party, meant to be a celebration of love, had turned into a public humiliation. Cynthia turned back to Richard, reaching for his hand, but he pulled away. Don't, he said coldly. I can't do this. And with that, he walked out. Cynthia felt her heart shatter as she watched him disappear into the night. But the nightmare wasn't over. Daniel leaned in close, his voice just above a whisper. This is only the beginning, darling. Cynthia knew in that moment that her past wasn't done with her yet. And Daniel, he wasn't going anywhere. Cynthia stood frozen, her pulse drumming wildly in her ears. The once lively engagement party had turned into a spectacle of whispers and judgmental stares. The music had long since faded, and the only sound that remained was the dull murmur of scandal spreading like wildfire. Daniel was still there, standing too close, his presence suffocating. His smirk was one of victory, but Cynthia knew better than to let him think he had won. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to stand tall. Why are you here, Daniel? She asked, her voice low but firm. Daniel chuckled, the sound dripping with amusement. Oh, Cynthia, come on. You didn't really think you could just erase me, did you? He gestured toward the crumpled divorce papers still in her hands. I never signed them, you never checked, and now, here we are. Cynthia's stomach twisted. She had been so sure, so confident, that she had severed all ties with him. But now, the evidence of her mistake was right in front of her, taunting her. I don't know what game you're playing, she said through gritted teeth. But whatever you think you're going to get out of this, you won't. Daniel tilted his head, a look of feigned innocence crossing his face. Oh, but Cynthia, I don't want anything. Well, nothing more than what's mine. Her breath caught. Richard. She turned sharply, her eyes darting toward the exit where Richard had disappeared moments ago. Panic clawed at her chest. If Daniel got to him first, if he poisoned him with more lies. Cynthia grabbed her purse and turned to leave, but Daniel's voice stopped her in her tracks. You really think he'll believe you after this? He said lazily, taking a sip from an abandoned champagne glass. The perfect Cynthia Walker caught in a web of her own deception. She spun back around, her nails digging into her palms. What do you want? Daniel grinned. That's more like it. The guests had begun to clear out, some still whispering, some throwing her looks of pity. Soon, the grand event hall was empty except for the two of them. Daniel walked forward, slow and deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. You see, Cynthia, I've been watching you. You've done well for yourself. New life, new fiancé, a fresh start. He clicked his tongue. Too bad it was built on a lie. Cynthia clenched her jaw. Get to the point. His expression darkened. I want what I'm owed. She narrowed her eyes. And what exactly do you think you're owed? Daniel leaned in, his voice low. Half. Cynthia's blood turned to ice. Half of what? She whispered. Daniel smirked. Everything. Your house, your business, your bank accounts. Legally, we're still married, which means... Cynthia shook her head. No way. You don't get to walk back into my life after all these years and demand. Daniel sighed, pulling something else from his pocket. A small, black flash drive. He held it between his fingers, twirling it. I thought you might say that. Cynthia stared at it. What's that? His smirk widened. Leverage. A shiver ran down her spine. Daniel stepped back, slipping the flash drive into his pocket. I'll give you 48 hours to think about it, sweetheart. He turned towards the door, pausing only to throw one last glance over his shoulder. Make the right choice. And then, he was gone. Cynthia's hands were shaking. Whatever was on that flash drive, whatever secret Daniel held, she had a sinking feeling that it could ruin her completely. And the worst part? She had no idea what it was. Cynthia stood alone in the now empty event hall, her world crumbling around her. The champagne glasses, the decorations, the rose petals scattered on the floor. Everything that had once symbolized the happiest night of her life was now a cruel reminder of how quickly everything could change. Her hands trembled as she clutched the crumpled divorce papers. The air was thick with the echoes of whispers, of judgment, of Richard's voice filled with hurt and betrayal. And then there was him. Daniel. The ghost of her past, the mistake she thought she had erased, had returned, stronger, sharper, crueler. His threat hung in the air, suffocating her. Leverage. Half. 48 hours. Cynthia took a deep breath, forcing herself to think. Number. She had fought too hard, built too much to let Daniel destroy her. She had clawed her way out of the dark, out of the wreckage of their toxic marriage. He wasn't going to pull her back in. With shaky hands, she grabbed her purse and hurried outside into the cold night air. She had to find Richard. She had to make him understand. Richard sat on the hood of his car, staring at the engagement ring in his hand. The night air was crisp, but the cold, he felt, was deeper. Bone deep, soul deep. Cynthia had lied to him. All this time, she had hidden a part of herself from him. A husband, a secret past, and the worst part, if Daniel hadn't shown up, she might have never told him. Footsteps approached, hesitant, careful. He didn't have to look up to know it was her. Richard, Cynthia said softly. Please. He exhaled, closing his eyes for a long moment before finally meeting her gaze. Her face was streaked with tears, her expression raw with pain. But he didn't know if it was because she had been caught, or because she was truly sorry. How long were you going to keep this from me? His voice was quiet, but it cut through the space between them like a blade. Cynthia swallowed hard. I thought it was over. I thought I was free. Richard let out a bitter laugh. But you weren't. She stepped closer. I didn't lie to hurt you, Richard. I swear. I was scared. I didn't want to lose you. Richard stared at her, searching her face, trying to reconcile the woman he loved with the woman standing before him now. The woman who had kept an entire life hidden from him. How can I believe anything you say now? He asked, his voice breaking. Tears welled in her eyes. Because I love you. He shook his head, his throat tightening. Love isn't just about the good parts, Cynthia. It's about trust. And I don't know if I can trust you anymore. A sob escaped her lips. Please, Richard, don't let him win. Richard clenched his fists. The thought of Daniel standing there, smirking, victorious, it made his blood boil. But this wasn't about Daniel. This was about Cynthia, the woman he had planned to spend forever with. The woman who had promised him honesty, yet had kept an entire marriage a secret. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he sighed. I need time. Cynthia's heart cracked. Does that mean? Richard looked at her, his expression unreadable. I don't know. Her breath hitched. She wanted to fight, to beg him not to walk away. But she knew she had no right to. This was the price of her secrets. Richard slipped the engagement ring into his pocket, then turned and got into his car. Cynthia stood there, watching as the taillights faded into the night, until she was left alone in the empty parking lot. Her heart ached. Her chest felt hollow. Daniel had torn her world apart in mere minutes. But as she wiped away her tears, a fire sparked in her eyes. Daniel thought he had won. He thought he could manipulate her, take everything she had built. But he had underestimated her. Cynthia Walker had spent her entire life rebuilding herself. And she wasn't about to let him destroy her now. With one last shaky breath, she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and stepped into the night. She had 48 hours, and she wasn't going down without a fight. Cynthia sat in the dim glow of her apartment, the city lights flickering through the window. The engagement ring Richard had given her lay on the table in front of her, taunting her. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional hum of a car passing below. She'd spent the last hour staring at the flash drive Daniel had given her, her fingers hovering over her laptop. Whatever was on it, it was meant to destroy her. Her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "Clock's ticking, sweetheart. 47 hours. Cynthia clenched her jaw. Daniel wanted her to feel helpless. He wanted her to break. But she wouldn't. With a deep breath, she plugged the flash drive into her laptop. The screen flickered, and a single folder appeared. Walker Files. Her stomach twisted as she clicked it open. Inside were dozens of documents, images, and video files. The moment she saw them, her blood ran cold. They weren't just random files. They were about her past, her real past, the one she had worked so hard to erase. There were court records, old financial statements, emails, things she never thought she'd see again. And then, at the bottom of the folder, there was a video file labeled Confession. Cynthia's hands shook as she clicked it. The screen lit up with an old recording, grainy but clear enough. And there she was, sitting in a dimly lit room, her face younger, her eyes filled with fear. She recognized the setting instantly. A police station. Her voice came through the speakers, shaky but firm. "I didn't mean for it to happen, I swear. It was self-defense." The officer across from her was unreadable. "Cynthia, we need the truth. Tell us exactly what happened that night." Cynthia's recorded self swallowed hard. "It was Daniel. He wouldn't let me leave. He grabbed me and I fought back. The next thing I knew, he was on the ground and there was so much blood." Cynthia slammed the laptop shut, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She felt like she was going to be sick. Daniel had this, after all these years? Her mind raced. The police report, the investigation, the case that had been quietly closed after months of back and forth. She had been cleared. There was no evidence tying her to anything criminal. It had been ruled an accident, and she had walked away. But Daniel had proof. Proof that she had been there. Proof that she had lied about the real events of that night. And now he was using it against her. Her phone buzzed again. "Reconsidering yet?" Cynthia gritted her teeth. She wanted to scream, to throw her phone across the room, but she forced herself to stay calm. Daniel wasn't going to win. She wouldn't let him. She grabbed her coat and keys, her mind already racing with a plan. If Daniel wanted to play games, she was going to make sure she was the one who finished them. An hour later, she was standing outside a quiet bar downtown. It wasn't the kind of place she normally went to, but tonight wasn't about comfort. It was about strategy. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the low hum of conversation. She spotted him instantly. Marcus Reed, an old contact. Someone who knew things. Someone who had cleaned up messes for people like Daniel in the past. She walked up to him, her heels clicking against the worn wooden floors. Marcus looked up from his drink, his sharp eyes scanning her. "Well, Well, if it isn't Cynthia Walker. I need your help, she said, sliding into the seat across from him. Marcus smirked, swirling his glass. Funny, last time we spoke, you said you were done with all this. Cynthia clenched her fists. That was before Daniel came back. At the mention of the name, Marcus's smirk faded. Daniel's back? She nodded. And he's got something on me. Something that could ruin everything. Marcus leaned forward, his expression turning serious. What kind of something? She hesitated, then pulled out a USB drive from her pocket. Watch it for yourself. Marcus took it and slipped it into his laptop. As the video played, his jaw tightened. By the time it ended, he exhaled deeply, rubbing a hand over his face. Damn. Yeah. Cynthia swallowed hard. I need it gone. I need him gone. Marcus sat back, studying her. You realize what you're asking me, right? She nodded. And I know you can do it. Marcus drummed his fingers on the table, thinking. Daniel's not an idiot. If he's holding on to this, he's got copies. Cynthia knew that. Then we find them, destroy them, whatever it takes. Marcus smirked. You've still got that fire, huh? She didn't answer. Marcus sighed, then stood up, slipping the USB drive into his pocket. All right, Cynthia, I'll see what I can do. She exhaled, relief washing over her. But before he walked away, he paused. One question, though. She looked up. What really happened that night? Cynthia's throat tightened. Marcus held her gaze, but when she didn't answer, he simply nodded. Didn't think so. And then he was gone. Cynthia sat there, her hands wrapped around her glass. She had fought so hard to escape the past. But now, she was realizing the truth. The past wasn't done with her yet, and neither was Daniel. Cynthia sat at the bar for a long time after Marcus left, her mind racing. The past was circling her like a predator, waiting for her to make a wrong move. She had spent years outrunning it, burying it, pretending that what happened that night was behind her. But Daniel had forced her to look it in the eyes, again. Her fingers tapped against her glass. She needed to stay ahead of him. Marcus would work his angles, but that wasn't enough. She needed leverage of her own. And there was only one person who could help her find Daniel's weak spot. 15 minutes later, she pulled up in front of a rundown apartment building on the east side of town. The neon open sign flickered above the entrance of a small liquor store nearby, casting a dull red glow on the cracked pavement. Cynthia took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. She climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor, her heels clicking against the worn-out tiles. She reached apartment 2B and knocked. A few seconds passed before the door cracked open, the chain lock still in place. A pair of wary eyes peered through. Then, a familiar voice. Cynthia? She let out a breath. Hello, Lisa? The door remained chained. Lisa, Daniel's younger sister, stared at her like she had seen a ghost. What the hell are you doing here? Cynthia gave her a pleading look. I need your help. Lisa scoffed. Oh, now you need my help? After disappearing for years? Cynthia's chest tightened. Lisa, please. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't important. Lisa hesitated, then unlatched the door and stepped aside. The apartment was small, cluttered, and smelled faintly of cigarette smoke. A baby monitor sat on the coffee table, crackling with soft static. Cynthia glanced toward the bedroom door, where a small nightlight cast a faint glow. Lisa had a child now. Cynthia hadn't known. Lisa folded her arms. Say what you have to say. Cynthia hesitated. It's about Daniel. Lisa's eyes darkened. Of course it is. Cynthia stepped forward. He's blackmailing me. He has something that could ruin my life. I need to know where he's keeping his files, his backups, anything that could help me destroy what he has on me. Lisa let out a bitter laugh. And you think I'd help you? After everything? Cynthia flinched. Lisa, I know I left. I know I should have done more back then. But I was barely surviving myself. Lisa shook her head. You think you were the only one suffering? Do you have any idea what it was like after you disappeared? The way he spiraled? The way he... She cut herself off, her jaw tightening. Cynthia swallowed hard. I do know. And that's why I need to stop him before he ruins more lives. Lisa turned away, rubbing a hand over her face. For a moment, Cynthia thought she was going to refuse. Then, Lisa sighed. He has a storage unit outside of town. He keeps backups of everything there. Cynthia's heart leapt. Do you know the address? Lisa nodded slowly. But it won't be easy. Daniel's paranoid. He has cameras, alarms. If he even suspects you're coming. Cynthia set her jaw. I don't care. I need to end this. Lisa hesitated, then walked to a drawer, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper. She scribbled something down and handed it over. This is it. Cynthia took it, gripping it tightly. Lisa met her eyes. Be careful. Cynthia gave a small nod. Thank you. As she turned to leave, Lisa spoke again. And Cynthia? She paused. If you find a way to stop him, don't hesitate. Cynthia didn't answer, because deep down, she already knew she wouldn't. An hour later, Cynthia pulled into the dark, deserted lot of the storage facility. The place was silent, except for the occasional buzz of a flickering overhead light. She gripped the steering wheel, steadying herself. This was it. She stepped out of the car, pulling her jacket tighter around her. The air was sharp, filled with the scent of rain on pavement. Unit 14C. She moved quickly, staying close to the shadows. The storage unit was near the back, partially hidden from the main road. Lisa was right. There were cameras. A red light blinked in the corner of the building. Cynthia reached into her pocket and pulled out a small can of spray paint, a trick she had learned years ago. She aimed carefully and sprayed over the lens. The red light flickered, then died. With her heart pounding, she pulled out a set of lock-picking tools, another skill from a past she had tried to forget. She worked quickly, her fingers moving with practiced precision. The lock clicked open. She pushed the door up just enough to slip inside. The air was thick with dust. Stacks of boxes lined the walls, along with an old desk covered in scattered papers. Cynthia grabbed a flashlight from her pocket and started searching. Her hands trembled as she rifled through folders, financial records, fake identities, evidence of other people Daniel had blackmailed. And then, finally, a labeled hard drive. Walker confession copy. Cynthia's breath caught. This was it. She grabbed it, clutching it tight. A cold voice cut through the silence. I was wondering when you'd show up. Her blood turned to ice. She spun around. Daniel stood in the doorway, a gun in his hand. He smiled. You really thought you could outplay me? Cynthia's grip tightened on the hard drive. Her mind raced. She was trapped. Cynthia's pulse pounded in her ears. The dim glow from the overhead light barely illuminated Daniel's face, but she could see the smug satisfaction in his expression. The gun in his hand was steady, his grip sure. She knew that look. It was the same one he had given her all those years ago. The night everything changed. She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the hard drive. You don't have to do this, Daniel. Daniel let out a low chuckle. Oh, Cynthia, you always were good at playing the victim. He tilted his head. Tell me, what was your plan? Take the hard drive and run. Destroy my files and hope I just forget about you. Her breath was shallow. I just want this to be over. His smirk widened. See, That's the problem. It's never over. You walked away from me, thinking you could erase the past. But you can't. You belong in it. She clenched her jaw. Number, I don't. Daniel's eyes darkened. You still don't get it, do you? He stepped closer, the gun never wavering. I own you, Cynthia. The moment you decided to play this game, you lost. Because you're not built to do what it takes to win. Cynthia's mind was racing. The hard drive was clutched in her hand, but it meant nothing if she couldn't get out of here alive. Daniel took another step forward, and then a loud crack split the air. Daniel jerked as something heavy collided with the back of his head. His grip on the gun faltered. A second blow sent him crumbling to the ground. Cynthia barely had time to process what had happened before she saw Lisa standing behind him, gripping a metal pipe, her chest heaving. Lisa's hands shook as she looked down at her unconscious brother. Cynthia stared in shock. Lisa? Lisa's breathing was ragged. I followed you. She tightened her grip on the pipe, her voice trembling. I knew he wouldn't let you walk away. Cynthia exhaled sharply, her legs finally moving. She crouched down and grabbed Daniel's gun, checking the safety before tossing it far out of reach. Lisa knelt beside her, her face pale. He's going to wake up soon. Cynthia nodded, her mind working fast. We need to end this now. Lisa swallowed hard. How? Cynthia held up the hard drive. He said I wasn't built to win. She looked Lisa in the eye. He was wrong. Lisa hesitated, then nodded. Let's do it. An hour later, Cynthia sat at her laptop in Lisa's apartment. The hard drive was plugged in, its contents spilling across the screen. Lisa paced behind her. Are you sure this will work? Cynthia's fingers flew over the keyboard. Daniel made a mistake. He thought his backups made him untouchable, but he underestimated how much dirt he's collected. Lisa frowned. What do you mean? Cynthia clicked on a folder labeled Leverage and turned the screen toward Lisa. There were dozens of names. Not just Cynthia. Politicians, business owners, people in power. Lisa's eyes widened. He's been blackmailing people for years. Cynthia nodded. And I'm going to make sure they know it. She pulled up an encrypted email client and began uploading files. Lisa watched in silence as Cynthia worked, sending the information to select recipients. Police, journalists, people who had the power to bring Daniel down. When the last file was sent, Cynthia leaned back, her heart pounding. Lisa swallowed. What now? Cynthia took a deep breath. Now, we wait. 48 hours later, the news broke in the morning. Corruption scandal unfolds. Businessman Daniel Walker under investigation. Cynthia watched from her apartment as reporters swarmed Daniel's home, cameras flashing, microphones shoved into the faces of officials who had once turned a blind eye. The footage cut to Daniel being led out in handcuffs, his face twisted in rage. For the first time in years, Cynthia felt free. Her phone buzzed. A message from Lisa. It's over. Cynthia exhaled, a slow, shaky breath. No, she thought. It was finally beginning. Cynthia sat in her apartment, the soft hum of the television filling the silence. The news played in the background, the image of Daniel being escorted into a police van flashing across the screen. His face was twisted with fury, his lips forming silent curses at the cameras. It should have felt like a victory, but Cynthia knew better. Daniel wasn't the type to accept defeat, even in handcuffs, even with his empire crumbling. He would be planning his next move. Her phone buzzed. A message from Lisa. I don't think this is over. Cynthia's stomach tightened. She typed back. Meet me. They met at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town, far from the flashing lights of the media frenzy. Lisa sat across from her, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. He still has people, Lisa said in a low voice. Connections. Even if he's locked up, he's not powerless. Cynthia exhaled, rubbing her temples. Then we need to make sure he doesn't get out. Lisa frowned. How? Cynthia reached into her bag and pulled out another flash drive. Lisa's eyes widened. What is that? The insurance policy, Cynthia murmured. Lisa hesitated before taking the flash drive, holding it between her fingers like it was a ticking bomb. What's on it? Cynthia's gaze darkened. The truth. Lisa didn't need to ask, which truth? Cynthia had held onto it for years, buried it deep, convinced herself that as long as Daniel stayed away, she would never have to use it. But that was before. Before he had tried to ruin her. Before he had taken everything she had built and nearly shattered it to pieces. Lisa swallowed hard. If you release this, there's no coming back. Cynthia nodded. I know. Lisa exhaled sharply, glancing out the window. You're sure? Cynthia thought about Richard, about the life she had almost had, about the people Daniel had destroyed, manipulated, blackmailed. She wasn't just doing this for herself. She looked at Lisa. Yes. Lisa nodded and tucked the flash drive into her pocket. I'll handle it. Cynthia gave her a small, grateful smile. For the first time in years, she wasn't carrying this alone. 1 week later, Daniel Walker's trial was swift. The evidence was too much. Police found bank accounts linked to multiple fraudulent schemes. Testimonies from his victims poured in. And then, the final blow. The video. The confession from that night. The real story. The bruises on Cynthia's arms. The fear in her voice. The truth about what happened in that dark apartment years ago. How Daniel had attacked her. How she had fought back. How the man who had tormented her had nearly ended her life before she took control of her own fate. It wasn't self-defense that had saved her that night. It was survival. And now the world knew. The court ruled against Daniel, sentenced to 25 years without parole. Cynthia stood outside the courthouse, the cold wind biting at her skin. Lisa stood beside her, silent. It was over, really, truly over. Lisa turned to her. What now? Cynthia inhaled deeply, the weight of the past finally lifting from her shoulders. Now? She exhaled slowly. I start over. For real this time. Lisa smiled faintly. You deserve that. Cynthia gave a small nod. She wasn't sure where she would go, what she would do, but for the first time in years, she wasn't running. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Richard. A single message. Can we talk? Cynthia's heart skipped. Maybe some things weren't completely lost after all. She turned to Lisa, a quiet strength settling in her chest. The past was finally behind her, and the future, it was hers to create. The end. If you loved this story, don't forget to like this post if you enjoyed the twists and turns. Comment your thoughts. What would you have done in Cynthia's place? Share with friends who love a good, suspenseful thriller. Subscribe for more gripping stories filled with drama, betrayal, and shocking twists. Your support means the world. Stay tuned for more thrilling content. Subscribe, like, share.